It's called Starship. It's built by the commercial company SpaceX. And this flight, its sixth test flight, was pretty amazing. Starship flew partway around the world to the Indian Ocean, where it hovered just above the water before splashing down.
And we have ship splashed down in the Indian Ocean.
Starship is the dream of the world's richest man, Elon Musk. Musk wants to make humans a multiplanetary species.
I think this is just an incredibly important thing for the future of life itself.
He wants to start building a city on Mars. And to do that, he needs Starship.
The holy grail breakthrough that's needed is a rapid and completely reusable rocket system.
But building this rocket is having a real impact on Earth. The launch site in Texas is located in the middle of one of the state's largest wildlife sanctuaries, and environmentalists say every launch is causing damage. So today on the show, we're going to talk to science correspondent Jeff Brumfiel about everything Starship, what the latest test shows it can do, what the environmental consequences of the test program might be, and what it could mean for Starship now that Musk's close ally, Donald Trump, is headed back to the White House. Jeff Brumfiel, hello.
Hello, Regina.
Welcome back. How did the launch go this week?
I mean, this was a very successful sixth test flight for SpaceX. So basically what happened was the rocket took off, its super heavy booster just powered it up partway to orbit, and then the booster broke off and came back towards Earth. Now, the booster was actually supposed to come back and land at the launch pad. Basically, these two giant arms on the launch tower, they call it Mechazilla.
I love that so much.
were supposed to come in as the booster hovered and sort of grab the booster and gently lower it back to the pad. Unfortunately, there was some damage to the launch tower during liftoff. It triggered an abort, and so the booster went back and landed in the Gulf of Mexico. It still sort of did that hover maneuver, but it landed in the water. Meanwhile, Starship went up. It went partway around the world. It did something which was pretty important. It relit one of its engines during flight, and then it re-entered over the Indian Ocean and came down near Australia, and also kind of conducted this vertical hovering landing over the ocean that was very impressive.
Okay, let's go back to what you're talking about with this, booster coming back down. Why do they want it to come back right down to the launch, right away?
Yeah, I know. It's a really strange way to do it because, other rockets just drop their boosters, or in the case of the space shuttle, sometimes they would go out into the ocean and retrieve the boosters. The idea here is very, very rapid reusability. And the reason they want rapid reusability is that Starship is supposed to be able to fly over and over again very quickly. So the idea is you catch the booster, you just lower it back on the launch pad, fill it back up with gas, and then you can go. And, Elon Musk says he wants this thing launching as often as 3 times a day.
Why does it need to launch so quickly?
So there's 2 reasons they want to be able to relaunch so quickly. First is cost. I mean, the faster you reuse a rocket, the cheaper it is to operate. But the other reason is really, really interesting. So, Starship is supposed to carry people to land on the surface of the moon, and Elon has said over and over he wants it to go to Mars. But here's the thing. To do that, you have a little bit of a trick, right? This is a very heavy rocket that runs off of liquid fuel. And so once it goes into space, it's basically almost out of fuel. So you need to refuel it in space. But because it's liquid fuel, as you know, Regina, when liquids are in vacuum, they tend to boil.
Right.
So you can only hold the fuel in orbit for so long. So basically the plan here is to launch a bunch of Starships full of fuel and then launch another Starship quickly enough and have it dock with a couple of Starships and fuel itself up and then go on to the moon or Mars. That's sort of the way this is supposed to work.
Okay.
But the only way that can happen is if you can launch them back to back to back very quickly so that you can fuel it up before all the gas boils away.
So, okay, Musk wants to launch these things 3 times a day. What does that mean for where they're launching these things?
That's a great question. So in the long term, Musk has said that he wants these launched from the middle of the ocean because, of course, launching a giant rocket is very disruptive.
Right.
I don't know if floating platforms will ever be able to launch Starships. I mean, I think that might be a little unrealistic. But in the near term, what they're planning to do is launch a lot more from this site in Texas.
Mm-hmm.
Now, this year, they are authorized to launch 5 times. Next year, they want to go up to as many as 25 times.
Mm-hmm.
And recently, just a few days ago, SpaceX executive Gwen Shotwell said that she would not be surprised if the company launched Starship 400 times in the next 4 years.
What?
And this has gotten environmentalists really worried because SpaceX's launch site in Texas is in the middle of a state and federal wildlife refuge.
How is that even allowed?
Yeah, well, it's a really interesting situation. So basically, this site is near the city of Brownsville. Right next to it is this large area known kind of colloquially as Boca Chica. It's a mix of state land and federal land and little parcels of private land sort of tucked away in there.
Oh.
So about 10 years ago, SpaceX bought these little patches of private land. And, on one site, they have their production facility, and on another site just up the road, they have their launch facility.
Wow. And you actually went there, right? Like, what did you see?
It's really a fascinating place to visit because it sits about a half hour outside of Brownsville along this 2-lane highway. It's sort of cutting through these native grasslands near the Gulf of Mexico that's home to hundreds of bird species, including many that stop over during migrations to Central and South America. I gotta say, the first impression of this place is it's absolutely beautiful out here. Much prettier than I was expecting. And there's Starbase right there sticking up out of these tidal flats. It's really quite remarkable. So this is the weird thing about the setup is, because there's public land right next to all of SpaceX's facilities, you could pull right up next to the launch complex and park there. And that's exactly what I did.
Wow.
And, it was so weird because you get out of your car, you're just parked on the side of the road next to a sand dune, and there's this, it's just so big, this huge rocket right there.
It was just there, the rocket. You could just see it.
Just standing right there on the pad. And, I met Justin LeClaire there. He's a biologist with the nonprofit Coastal Bays, Bends, and Estuaries, which monitors wildlife in Boca Chica. We nailed it today. Look at this. The whole rocket's here.
Indeed. It's always different out here. The biggest building back at production, with all the glass and stuff in the front, that was not anywhere near that close to being done. Last time I was here a month and a half ago. So they just fly through everything.
So Justin and I started climbing back into the dunes next to the launch pad.
Wow. So this is all coastal prairie. We're getting kind of into the dune habitat here as well.
And as soon as we get back there, we start seeing these enormous chunks of concrete.
So you can see some rebar kind of poking up through the grass all over here. Those are ones they haven't picked up, but it was basically a minefield of debris out here after the April 2023, that first flight test.
So the first flight of Starship was particularly damaging to the local environment because the rocket was so powerful, it actually blew a hole in its launch pad.
Wow. I mean, when you say there's just debris everywhere, I just imagine animals walking through there, just chunks of debris flying everywhere.
Yeah, I mean, it was a lot. And part of the reason this happened was SpaceX, in their rush to get Starship flying, did not install a standard piece of equipment known as a water deluge system.
Okay.
Now, this is designed to suppress the power of the rocket engines. And basically, it's a giant upside-down shower that sprays hundreds of thousands of gallons of water under the rocket as it launches.
Mm-hmm.
So they put one of these things in, and that solved that problem, but it also created a new problem because the launch pad is completely flat.
Mm-hmm.
And so every launch, the water goes everywhere.
Quite a lot does spill off, either is projected off or kind of runs off.
Into the wetlands. Now, SpaceX says, look, this is drinking water used in the system. It's not dangerous. But the fact of the matter is it does contain some harmful chemicals after it comes in contact with the rocket exhaust. And the EPA classifies this water as industrial wastewater. So just letting it spill out into wetlands violates the Clean Water Act.
Mm-hmm.
SpaceX knew this before 2 other launches earlier this year, but they launched anyway, and they later got fined by the EPA and local regulators. regulators.
So what does SpaceX say about all this, like how they're affecting the environment?
Yeah, I mean, SpaceX didn't talk to me directly, but they did put out a lengthy statement on this issue in September. And they said, quote, "The narrative that we operate free or in defiance of environmental regulation is demonstrably false.
Okay.
SpaceX is committed to minimizing impact and enhancing the surrounding environment where possible." And they went on to list a number of things they do that they claim minimizes the impact of all this.
Okay, Jeff, SpaceX is like racing ahead here, right? But Donald Trump has been reelected and he and Elon are buddies. So, like, what's the impact likely to be?
Yeah, I've been speaking to people about that this week, and I think there's likely to be sort of two areas where we're going to see some changes in SpaceX's relationship to the government. The first is regulation. So Starship is regulated by the Federal Aviation Administration in consultation with other agencies like the Environmental Protection Agency. And those regulators have been perceived as slowing down Starship's launches, due in part to these environmental concerns. I spoke to Lori Garver, a former deputy administrator of NASA under Barack Obama, and she thinks all that's about to change.
The FAA and the EPA will not be raising flags as they have been these last couple of years.
Now, there may still be barriers. Environmental groups are already suing the FAA for failing to conduct an adequate environmental review of Starship's impact on Boca Chica, and those suits are still going to go forward. But in terms of the regulators, that may ease up quite a bit.
Okay, so less regulatory oversight. What else might change?
Well, the other thing is money. SpaceX gets billions in government contracts, including money for Starship, but it's not the only player. So, for example, NASA has spent nearly $100 billion trying to get astronauts back to the moon. A sliver of that money has gone to Starship, which is theoretically going to work as a lunar lander like we talked about. Tim Ferrer is president of a consulting firm called TMF Associates, which tracks SpaceX's business. He says it's quite possible Musk is going to try and push more money from other parts of the moon program into Starship.
There are many different companies involved in building things, and Musk would say, well, do we need all of those? Why don't you give us the money and we'll do all of this with Starship instead?
And SpaceX has already surged ahead in the launch market in recent years with its other rockets.
Wow.
And Ferrer says its power is going to grow almost inevitably.
Musk's influence will presumably only boost that dominance.
The most visible sign of all this change is going to be Starship. We'll see if they actually get up to 25 launches next year. But even if they only do a fraction of those, the program will make huge strides with its goal of rapid reusability for space exploration. And it's also going to have big environmental consequences for the grasslands that surround the launch site.
Well, we're going to have you back next year and you can tell us more.
Sounds good.
All right. Thank you so much, Jeff. This episode was produced by Rachel Carlson and edited by our showrunner, Rebecca Ramirez. Tyler Jones checked the facts. Maggie Luthar was the audio engineer. Beth Donovan is our senior director, and Colin Campbell is our senior vice president of podcasting strategy. I'm Regina Barber. Thank you for listening